LiSTNR production.
June 26 is International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. The AFP and Customs intercept hundreds of tons of narcotics every year. But the techniques of criminals and smugglers are becoming more complex and, unfortunately, more effective. In this week's Rewind episode, Brent Sanders talks with Nigel Phair, a former Australian Federal Police officer who took on a range of high-profile drug importation cases, which saw him intercepting large quantities of drugs, investigating its origin and surveilling its eventual destination in Australia.
From when I put in my first application to when I commenced in Canberra, it was a good 12 months. So I had to do an interview panel with a bunch of other people. I had to have a medical, I had to have psychoanalysis, and I also had to do a whole lot of written English testing. They gave me a book and I had to hand in an assignment every week for, I'm going to say, at least 8 weeks. And then they let you know that you're in, and then they let you know when there's a next vacant spot on a recruitment course. When I finished my recruit training, they gave us 3 options. They said you can go to Sydney, you can stay in Canberra, or you can go to Melbourne. Canberra didn't hold much allure in the late 80s. I'm pretty sure there was tumbleweeds going through the place on a Sunday afternoon. Melbourne didn't particularly appeal either. I was from Sydney and all my mates were there. So I actually went back to Sydney and spent the first 8-9 years of my career in Sydney. So when we turned up in Sydney, we did 3 weeks of local procedures, learning about what goes on. And then back then, the AFP was a very different organisation to the multidisciplinary crime-fighting organisation it is now. Back then, it was essentially 2 things. They either did drug investigation or they did fraud investigations. Now, I was put in the drug investigations team, and that was great. We basically did investigations against using the Customs Act 1901. So that was importation. So any drugs around that was street level in Sydney, the New South Wales Police had carriage of that responsibility. And then anything that was imported, we did that. So a day in the life of depended which part of the drug unit you were in. If you're in a long-term targeting role, you'd be looking at big, serious organised criminal activity, the multi-kilo importations. If you're doing response, you might spend a fair bit at the airport working with customs who are detecting people bringing in drugs on their person or in their person, in their baggage, etc. And then there's everything in between. But, these were days when there was no computer. So you literally did police work all day long. You were out there doing it.
Now, looking at that, Nigel, if I could take you to 1996, you're a detective constable. You're involved in a cocaine importation from Uruguay. Can you just walk us through this case and your involvement in it?
So that matter was the importation of around 12 kilos of cocaine. And we were notified of that by customs. And what it was a carriage. And when I say carriage, a horse-drawn type carriage that had come in from South America. And it was situated on a timber and steel ramp, a platform. So it'd come in through a ship, arrived in Australia. Customs had, for whatever reasons, inspected it, and they'd found a quantity of drugs. So we went out there to seize it. So because customs don't have any investigation powers like the AFP does. First, we had to actually get it through quarantine, and for quarantine, for us to be happy, they had to blast the insides out with high-pressure hoses and lots of detergent and antifungal spray, to the extent that this carriage was not particularly well built and was particularly old, and it almost fell apart with their efforts. So we did a good enough job for that. And then we got the ramp, and that's sort of the ramp which was where the drugs were secreted. It was square tubular steel being welded up at the ends and were placed inside it. So what we did, we got it back, we took all the drugs out, we weighed them all, we measured them all, and replaced them with an inert substance. and did what we call a controlled delivery. And that is, we sent the carriage and the ramp on its way as though it would normally happen, and we surveilled what happened thereafter.
So customs are the initial folks that discover this cocaine, 12 kilos or thereabouts, within this horse-drawn cart, or cart that would eventually be drawn by a horse. Did they have some intel around that, or are these things just purely random and just the luck of the draw?
Well, I think then a lot of it was random. There wasn't the sophisticated in intelligence like there is now. The AFP has always had international liaison officers that used to help with intelligence, and I don't know in this particular matter how customs detected it.
I'd imagine now, Nigel, and certainly as your career and your time within the federal police moved on and you went up through the ranks, what have you, there would be a lot more, I would imagine, communication and involvement with other police entities overseas and that type of thing with regards to importation and where drugs are coming from. We're going back here, 1996. It sounds like a little hit and miss with regards to what's coming through customs, and sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you won't.
Yeah, definitely. Back then, we had good relationships with other mature and like-minded police jurisdictions, and the ones that really stick out are the RCMP, the Canadian Federal Police, and also the Dutch Police. So both those organisations had similar interests that we had when it came to importation. The Canadians particularly, because we used to do a lot of investigations into Southeast Asian organised crime, and Sydney back then had a large cohort, just like it still does, of Southeast Asian people, and Vancouver also had a similar cohort that used to get up to various criminal activities. So there's a lot of similarities between AFP and RCMP back then. And again, the Dutch, which have always been very professional and very sophisticated in their drug interdiction, a lot of precursor chemicals used to come out of the Netherlands, and a lot of amphetamine and other substances which came to Australia were often based, point of manufacture and origin were the Netherlands. So, yeah, sure, the FBI and sure the Met Police, etc. in the UK, but those other two were probably the main ones. The Royal Hong Kong Police were also a lot of work with those, and then anything else was sort of on a needs basis. But yes, if we fast forward now, not only is there a lot better interactions with the AFP and a whole host of international law enforcement agencies, but also in Australia we work together so much better, which is great. When I was around, the AFP versus the New South Wales Police was not a good relationship professionally. It was very us against them, and thankfully, when you look at counter-terrorism, for example, they're joined at the hip. When you look at close personal protection, even cybercrime investigations now, they work very closely together, and I think that's great for Australia.
Nigel, just taking half a step back, via customs identified this suspicious sort of cart. You've taken it apart. You've found a quite a large quantity of cocaine. You've replaced that with whatever. Then you do surveillance on that cart, and it goes from where it was under customs care to the person who was obviously waiting and looking to pick that up. You're surveilling that. How does that sort of unfold?
So yes, it went out near the Penrith area, west of Sydney, and it was freighted out on the back of a tow truck, flatbed. So we followed it out there, and it went out to this premise, and it took receipt of it by the owner of that premise, where it was delivered, and we let it sit there for a number of hours to see what was happening. It was on a large 5-acre block, so we really didn't have any idea of what was happening. We had some tamper-proof devices on it to see whether anything was going to, if there was any changes to it, to the ramp and also the carriage. And we sat back and monitored it for quite a few number of hours before someone made the decision, well, let's go in. We already had search warrants because we knew where it was going to be delivered to. So we already had search warrants pre-prepared and pre-sworn. So we went ahead and executed those search warrants on that premise.
The physical surveillance that is involved with, for example, following that cart from the customs area out to Penrith, shine a light on that for us. That's a couple of cars, unmarked cars, I'd imagine, plainclothes police. Is it anything more dramatic than that, or more a flash than that, or is it the coppers sitting there watching for hours and hours and hours in an unmarked car, looking for somebody to come and make contact with it?
Yeah, in this matter, it was nothing particularly stealthy because it was just on a regular tow truck. So we knew that wasn't a criminal. We knew they wouldn't be looking to see whether the police were following them. So that was relatively simple. It was not driving fast. It was simple to sort of stay in the traffic with it, and we knew where it was going. So nothing great about that. But yes, when we got there, it is literally sort of, being close enough to try and see what's going on, but far enough away so that you don't get seen, because we were in a call it the semi-rural area as it was back then. It was quite easy to camouflage yourself in and around.
Right. So the cart's on the premise. The premise is obviously a premise owned by somebody who has had this delivered to them, and they then, by association, are the person who has received the drugs, and that becomes the pointy end of the investigation, I would imagine. There's a nice little twist here too with the gentleman I think that you initially were chatting to, an Elvis impersonator, Nigel. Is that correct?
It was correct, and it was interesting because not only was he an Elvis impersonator, but he was also a welder by trade. And because he had the Elvis wig, the big hair, and because it was had a lot of nylon in it, and because he was also a welder, it had large chunks missing out from when he was wearing it during the day and welding. So he was a lovely chap, but yeah, it was hard to keep a straight face.
He was a little bit of an intermediary. Is that right, this guy? There was somebody else who came to actually pick the drugs up.
Correct. It was definitely not for him. We'd obviously already done some background checking on that premise before it went there, who lived there, their antecedents, and the like. So we had a bit of a picture that it probably wasn't for him, but you just didn't know who was also staying there. But after an interview process and further investigation, we determined he was just the intermediary. He was accepting it for the proverbial friend of a friend. Once we worked that out, we went into the next stage of the investigation, which was trying to work out who this friend of a friend was, and hopefully seeing whether they would turn up and pick up the carriage and the ramp.
And how do you then, just the nuts and bolts of this, Nigel, how do you prevent our Elvis impersonator from making contact with that individual, say, hey, our cover's been blown here, the federal police are onto us, don't come over? How do you prevent that from occurring?
Well, to some extent, it's quite hard to do that because, he wasn't under arrest. He was allowed to leave his property. We weren't surveilling him. It's not, he could have gone and met with anyone, really. You make decisions during an investigation based on the resources that you have and the risks involved. And we determined that probably wouldn't happen. And I don't believe it did happen.
It's gone from Uruguay to Sydney, and a chap comes in from the US to Sydney to pick up these drugs. That seems a rather convoluted process to get hold of that cocaine.
Well, yes, it does appear that way. And when we were before the court, these were all the questions that we were posing to the jury about common sense and what people do. And when people put it into their own perspective, if you're a juror, some things don't quite add up. But yeah, flew in. We monitored the ramp and the carriage for some nearly 40 days before he came along. And then he came along and said, I want to pick this up. And we had a video of him doing that, where it was situated. We had that monitored both with audio and video. And he came along and he had a good look at the ramp, in and under it, and those sorts of things. And remembering, this had been welded in. So we were waiting for the perpetrator, at this stage, the person behind it that just flew in and act in furtherance. When you want to charge someone, they need to do two things. It's mens rea and actus reus, the guilty act and the guilty mind. So police have to prove both those things. So part of doing this sort of investigation is to sort of see what guilty act the person may or indeed may not do.
What was his intention around that? Was he looking to distribute those in Australia or to take them back to the US?
We never determined that. And when we arrested him and he sat through a formal tape record of interview, he made some admissions to some things and no admissions to other things. So when we asked him about, he basically he didn't admit to the importation. He didn't admit that he knew there were drugs there. And he just thought that he'd been stitched up by someone.
Out of interest, what was his explanation for flying from America to go to Penrith to pick up a horse cart? What was his explanation for that?
His explanation was to set up, he had the goal of coming to Australia to open up a Mexican restaurant, and this was going to feature in the restaurant. But, when you dig a little bit deeper, there was no plan to open up any restaurant. When you said to him, so where's this restaurant going to be and why in Sydney and a whole lot of other whys, there was nothing behind it.
When you're working at that federal policing level, you've got these drugs coming in from overseas. I guess you're never quite sure as the level of involvement or the level of the people that you're dealing with, where they sort of sit in the whole scheme of things, because, there's almost got to be a puppeteer somewhere that's directing all this. Have you ever worked in these situations where you've been lucky enough that one leads you to someone else, which leads you to the kingpin with these drug importations?
Yeah, occasionally that happens, and also what he's goes probably back to the interrelationship between state and federal police. Is the closer they can work together, that you can work that out. So if you look at drug importations, that might be done by a particularly ethnic group, all the way through to distributing on the streets of a suburb in Sydney, for example. So the state police might be involved in in locking up the street level distributors, and they might get some information which leads to the medium level ones, in which the AFP can then investigate the importation component. And then if you can, with your international partners, work out who the hierarchy is in a particular serious and organised crime group, and invariably they probably are based offshore, and invariably the best we often get to do are charge low to medium level people. The reality is the smart criminals never get hands-on when it comes to drugs. In fact, they rarely get hands-on when it comes to any crime type. So that's how they stay in business. They employ other people and they pay them money, and they do that. And they also might live in a jurisdiction that has a weak law enforcement themselves, where there's a level of either inability or corruption. And that's another way they sort of go about their lives.
I would imagine, Nigel, that things became more sophisticated over time, both policing methods, but also I'm interested in the methods that are used by these criminals. How sophisticated did they become in your time in the federal police with regards to these importations? Because there's an element of unsophisticated nature, isn't there, around the cart coming in sort of from overseas. I'm sure since that time things have got a little more sophisticated. Did this criminal element ever, for example, send in dummy type importations which aren't actually drugs to gauge what the police reaction is and how they're intercepting, importations? How does that work? How's that evolved over time?
Well, criminality's evolved massively through a number of ones. Yes, they have done dummy runs, but back then they were doing dummy runs in the 90s. There was nothing unusual about that. Probably what evolved was the importation of amphetamines and also precursor chemicals, which were using chemistry placed in other liquids, which could be, call it boiled off or otherwise, like cans of tomatoes and those sorts of things. So they were either in the can that were put in at the cannery and were separately packaged, or they were just part of the liquid. And using chemistry at the other end to siphon off the narcotic drug. So lots of sophistication around the whole drug thing. I think the other thing is serious and organised criminals kind of once really their bailiwick was drugs, and it still is to some degree, but they're much more multidisciplinary in their crime types now. And we've also got to remember a large part of this is also the money laundering aspect, because drugs come in, but money needs to come out. And whilst Australia has gotten better when it comes to money laundering, naturally criminals have also got better at it, because, once upon a time cash was king for all of us, just like it was with criminals, and now it's getting harder for criminals, to use cash. You think to yourself, when was the last time you paid a bill with cash or did anything with cash, But, it's an important part of the money laundering side, because I did a secondment at the National Crime Authority in the 90s also, and their whole investigational ethos was that follow the money and you'll find the drugs, whereas the AFP/Customs would be, where's the drugs, where's the drugs? But the NCA had a ton of lawyers and accountants that would pore over accounts and how businesses operate to sort of see how legit they were and how money was being transferred overseas. This was a time when structuring offences were dropped from $10,000 eventually to $5,000. So you could only go to a bank if you had over $10,000 in cash. They had to raise what was called a suspect transaction. So, you had money mules just all day, every day, going to different branches or banks all around the place with $9,900 depositing it to go overseas.
Now, you mentioned that before, the example of, say, a can of tomatoes or something like that, and within that, there's the capacity to boil that down or go through some sort of process to extract the drug from it. That's very sophisticated. How would the AFP... how do they get wind of that? Is that through intelligence? Is that through surveillance? Is that through working with people overseas? Because that's a tricky one to pick up at customs, I would imagine, unlike the going back to the old the cart from earlier, 96.
Yeah, for sure. All of the above. It's using all the tools and techniques at your disposal to look at, what it is, how it is, when it comes to importation, because, standard techniques aren't going to pick that up if it looks legitimate. But, luckily for police, people still do stupid things, and that makes life a little bit easier. I don't think we've ever had an accurate picture of the amount of drugs that really come into this country, because when I look back at and I think of all the multi-ton importations that the police have interdicted over the years, makes zero dent to supply.
Coming up, drug targeting and how police use it to trace the importation of hash.
Nigel, I can take you forward, if I could, 1997. You're involved in some physical and digital type surveillance in northern New South Wales over the Queensland border. Can you chat to us about this case and your involvement in it?
So this was a matter of drug targeting. So we had a good idea. There was a group of people based in that area, northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, etc., that were importing hash. But we didn't know much about it or how it was being worked and all that sort of stuff. So it was quite a prolonged and protracted investigation. So quite a few of us went up that area and we had an idea of who some of the criminals were. But again, we didn't have a full picture of who was involved in this. For a while, we spent some time living next door, in fact, to one of the criminals, one of the I wouldn't say principals, one of those that were involved in it, just getting an idea of what he did in his day-to-day life, who might come to visit him, who he might go and visit, just trying to get an idea of the whole picture. And in between that, we had intercepts on other premises. We had intercepts on various people's telephones to try and work out what it was, until we determined there was going to be a drug importation that took place, when and where that was going to take place. At the time, nothing unusual about that. They were the tools and techniques that were available, because people just had standard landline telephones. Mobiles were barely a thing.
So you're doing surveillance, physical surveillance on him. You're in close proximity. What does that entail?
Well, he was living in a house, and we just rented the house next door. Almost shared the same driveway. There was no, barely this is regional New South Wales with 5-row houses, and they're all pretty close to each other. So we were just next door. We did a bit of fishing and we did a bit of barbecuing, and we had a boat with us, and we just tried to blend in that we were just holiday makers while observing, what he was doing, where he was going, who was coming to visit him, that type of thing.
And it would have involved, I imagine, listening devices, some telephone intercepts and that type of thing. So
correct.
So you're monitoring information coming through also at that time?
We were monitoring 24/7.
And what was his involvement, or what was the involvement at that level with regards to this hash importation?
Well, in the end, he only had a minor involvement, and he only received by quantity of the importation, because there ended up being an importation of 12 tons. He received 20 kilos. So still a lot, but in perspective, he just got a small amount.
How do you bring that quantity of drug into Australia? How was this brought in? What was the process of getting that onto Australian soil?
Well, so that was what we see a lot now of, which was a mothership type environment. So a very large ship that sailed in to the waters of New South Wales, and then a trawler went out and met that about 100 nautical miles off the coast, I think, but went out for a while. So we knew this trawler was going out, and then some of us, myself included, we jumped on a customs vessel and we followed it out there. So we kept out of sight and just kept an eye on what this trawler was doing. But it went out, met the mothership, received the drugs at sea, and then came back in through to Port Stephens. We literally came up alongside it as it was docking. We didn't attempt any interdiction at sea. It would have been way too risky. We didn't have the full skills on what to do around that. We're only lightly armed. We just waited till it pulled up, and then as they pulled up, we pulled up next to it and jumped on board.
At that point, how far do those tentacles go? Because there would be additional intelligence, I would imagine, that can be gleaned from those individuals with regards to who's going to pick those drugs up and then who's going to distribute them in the street. Would that be correct?
That would be correct, but my recollection, particularly the person I interviewed, was saying nothing. They exercised their rights and didn't participate in a formal record of interview, which is fine. And I find that an interesting point, because a lot of police get disturbed when people won't talk to them, and they try their hardest to sort of get, you see the TV shows, they get them to try and turn them and all that sort of thing. But I've always been of the solid belief that if the only evidence you have is a formal tape record of interview where you have admissions or false denials, then you've got really nothing else, because if that gets thrown out in court, you've got nothing else. So I've always been in the belief that if you get someone in an interview room and they say, look, I'm choosing not to talk to you, that's fine, and you just process them and put them in a cell, because you should already have most of your evidence or know where most of your evidence is. So I've never been worried about criminals, not talking, whereas plenty of people do see that as an issue and, want to get them to spill the beans.
What would somebody like that, with that involvement, what would he be charged with?
He would be charged with prohibited import, so against the Customs Act. There's knowingly concerned, there's prohibited import, and there's conspiracy to import are the three main offences that you use.
They have brought in a substantial amount of drugs, 12 tonne. What was the end result there, Nigel? Custodial sentences, how did that finish up?
Yeah, so quite a few people got various custodial sentences. I'm going to talk about in the dozens or so. From a logistical perspective, it was interesting because it took us 3 days to unload it at Port Stephens. And then what you do with 12 tonnes, it's hard to find a truck that will take that amount of drugs. We had to hire a big Hertz truck and drive it back to Sydney, and then we had to put it in the vault. And, it's a lot. You had to find a vault big enough to put it. There's a lot of logistical headaches around securing that amount of drugs, and it all has to be weighed, it all has to be analysed, each sort of block. And then at the end of the day, after the matter's been all through court, some years later, it has to be destroyed.
Nigel, I want to just thank you so much for joining us here today for a chat. Thank you for your 22 years of service to the good folks of New South Wales and down there in Canberra, and for the work that you continue to do and the passion that you have. And let's hope we continue to improve our efforts in that space. So, Nigel, thank you for coming on board, and really enjoyed our time having a chat with you.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.